Moscow, a Soviet court tries American pilot Francis Gary Powers for espionage. Spectators at the highly publicized proceedings include Powers' wife and his parents. In the courtroom, as foreign cameramen are barred, Powers pleads guilty and says he was under contract to the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency.
The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union is perhaps the most dangerous yet most important part of Cold War history. The two nations were forced to spy on each other in order to get the upper hand in science, weaponry, and intelligence that would allow for international dominance. This conflict shifted forms when an American spy pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was shot down while spying on the Soviet Union, resulting in a quiet international crisis. The Gary Powers incident demonstrated the prevalence of espionage conducted between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it resulted in the tension-alleviating exchange of Powers and a captured Soviet spy.
Right after a dramatic change in the U.S.'s wealth, which started increasing in the early 20s, Francis Gary Powers was born in Jenkins, Kentucky in 1929 to Oliver and Ida Powers. He then enrolled in Milligan College, receiving his bachelor's degree in pre-med in 1950, deciding to enlist in the Air Force at the start of the Korean War. Powers flew F-84 Commandos while assigned to the 468th Strategic Fighter Squadron at Turner Air Force Base in Georgia. The Vietnam War had just begun, and Powers was discharged from the Air Force in 1956 with the rank of captain, quickly joining the CIA's U-2 program. By this time, Powers was a seasoned veteran of covert surveillance flights.
But with decisions rising in the heat of the Cold War, suspicion was high among both the Soviet Union and the United States. Both countries feared the unknown capabilities of the other. A need for information on the enemy drove major decisions to be made by President Dwight Eisenhower, who was serving in his first term as president, anxious after a decade of global chaos. He attempted to create mutual programs of intelligence with the Soviets, such as in 1955 at a conference in Geneva, where he proposed an open skies plan in which each country would be permitted to make overflights of the other to conduct mutual aerial inspections of nuclear facilities and launch pads. The Soviet Union rejected this proposal. This distrust between the two countries led to the creation of intelligence efforts by the United States government tasked with finding the nuclear capabilities of the Soviets. The U-2 spy plane was the perfect fit for this. Pilots were deployed from various bases near Soviet territory, such as that in Pakistan, where Gary Powers took his fateful liftoff to continue intelligence collection. The U-2 planes were ideal for the kind of missions the United States needed to coordinate in order to obtain information. Although they could fly at 70,000 feet, which was believed to be outside of Soviet radar range, the Soviets had known of the existence of the American U-2 planes but did not have the missile capabilities to shoot them down. This all changed, however, when Powers, en route to a Norway base, was shot down by a Soviet-operated missile. Trapped in the aircraft as it hurled towards the ground, Powers managed to dislodge himself from the tight cockpit and prepare for ejection. Unfortunately for the Americans, Powers was not able to hit the self-destruct button on the plane, which would have destroyed vital information about his flight plan and mission that ended up convicting him of espionage. In a daze, he maneuvered out of his seat so that his legs wouldn't be torn off when he ejected from the aircraft. He finally opened the canopy and flew out of the aircraft safely, parachuting to the ground before being captured by officers of the KGB. Powers was acutely aware of the poison pill that was hidden inside a silver dollar issued to him by the CIA, but he held out on that option as he was taken to KGB headquarters for questioning. The U.S., knowing that Powers had been compromised, immediately sought to craft a cover story that would prevent the impending international scandal, claiming that Powers had simply been researching weather for NASA while accidentally straying off course. The cover-up went as far as to present the U.S. media with the U-2 plane painted with fake NASA logos as serial numbers. But with the discovery of the crashed U-2 plane, the Soviets had learned enough not to buy this story. They put Powers on trial for espionage in Moscow after much international debate over how to handle this whole ordeal.
While captured, Powers had revealed enough to the KGB to lead them to understand that he wasn't the major threat, only a player in the system that was attempting to gather intelligence on the Soviet operations. In an interview with Francis Gary Powers Jr., Powers described the threats of death, sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, roughing up, and yelling and screaming that was directed at him. Finally, with both the US and Soviets watching, Powers was put on trial for espionage.
Moscow's Hall of Columns was packed for the most dramatic trial that even Russia has staged for many years. Francis Gary Powers, US pilot of the U-2 espionage plane, had pleaded guilty. and could only hope that the sentence passed by the three judges, Lieutenant General Boris Ogdebsky presiding, would be lenient.
The trial was felt by many across the world, especially global leaders. President Eisenhower was even asked about the trial.
Himself, opinion on the actual conduct of the trial. To this, he says,
now in the actual conduct of the trial, as it goes on, I would have no comment.
Eisenhower additionally criticized the Soviet Union for their conduct of the trial, saying,
the president is asked to comment on the Soviet contention that the United States itself is on trial.
This does not put the United States on trial whatsoever. If they want to say that they putting me on trial, that's their privilege. But to put the United States on trial in this way is just another piece of their propaganda that distorts fact into their own line of charge and allegation.
the stakes were high, with powers possibly facing 15 years in Soviet prison.
The exchange that the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to execute was simple. The United States would get Francis Gary Powers and student Frederick Pryor back, and the Soviet Union would get Colonel Rudolf Abel, a convicted Russian spy, in return. The exchange took place on February 10, 1962. Powers and Abel were exchanged in the middle of the Glienicke Bridge. This was an ideal exchange point, as the border between East Germany and West Berlin runs through the middle of the bridge. The Soviet Union found that the deal was made by a desire to improve relations, as both nations were on the brink of nuclear war, so easing tensions between them was of great importance. In a released CIA document, Powers was quoted saying, "I will never fly over Soviet Russia again." Although the United States and Soviet Union were facing turmoil, the act of exchange brought them closer, as they were forced to work together in order to achieve a universal compromise, getting their soldiers home. When the Soviet Union created conflict by shooting down Powers while he was spying, the United States had known that this action was bound to happen. The United States knew that the Soviets' technology was increasing exponentially. Likewise, the Soviet Union knew that the United States was spying on them, therefore they were waiting for their technology to allow them to stop the American U-2 spy planes from flying in their territory. Once the Soviets' technology was capable of shooting down these U-2s, they knew that a conflict would arise. Both nations were aware of the possible conflicts, so they were waiting for the other country to act. The nations knew that they had to drift away from conflict once it started in order to stop a nuclear war. The exchange was crucial in creating compromise in this era of war because it showed that the two nations could work something out and not despise each other. The conflict was Powers being shot down in the Soviet Union in an already uneasy world, and the compromise was the exchange that the US and Soviets agreed to, where they would both get their own spies back. This eased tensions and stopped a possible nuclear war from occurring. It showed that the United States and the Soviet Union wanted the best for their nations and were willing to set aside their belligerent behavior in order to reach a common goal. Even today, we can see many parallels between the Powers espionage incident and the Edward Snowden case from 2013. Both occurred during a time of tensions between the US and Russia. Snowden had leaked classified US documents exposing the US of surveillance activities that were meant to be kept secret. With this, many of the feelings associated with the Cold War started to creep back into the daily lives of Americans. What can be expected is that this new surveillance and espionage cyber conflict will end in either a war or a compromise.